This lecture is going to be about Habermas's essay, Modernity An Incomplete Project, which is included in this fabulous little collection called The Anti-Aesthetic. Um, Habermas's essay was originally given on the occasion of him being awarded the Adorno Prize. And the context is important because the essay's targets are both the Frankfurt School, out of which he kind of came, and then the current sort of strains of postmodernity that he really wanted to speak against. It is in this sense both forward-looking and backward-looking in its aspect. Habermas picks up the slogan from German newspapers' response to the 1980s Venice Biennale, postmodernism equals anti-modernism. This statement, he says, describes an emotional current of our times which has penetrated all spheres of intellectual life. And bear in mind, this is more than 40 years ago he's saying this. So following Jauss, Habermas traces the word modern back to its first appearance in the 5th century, when it was used to distinguish the Christian period from the pagan past. The idea of the modern has since then known several iterations, and Jameson's book on the modern counts 21 separate uses of the term since the 5th century. But in each instance, it is used, as Habermas puts it, to express consciousness of an epoch that relates itself to the past as an antiquity in order to view itself as a result of a transition from the old to the new. So modern equals new era, new epoch, a moment in history that has somehow broken its continuity with the past. So the term modern is thus rather elastic, and there have been several periods in history that have described themselves as modern for very different reasons. And as Habermas notes, people have described themselves as modern in the 5th century, but also in the 12th century and in the 17th century, in each case without apparent irony or awareness of the previously described modern eras. Our own current version of modernity appeared in the mid-19th century and was formed in opposition to the idea of tradition. And in many ways, it's sort of coeval with the idea of contemporary capitalism. So Habermas doesn't explicitly say it, but this opposition is in reality a city versus country, industry versus agriculture kind of model. The new version of the modern that erupts in the mid-19th century allows for the idea that new works can become classic without reference to actual classics or the classical period, which refers to ancient times. So contrast this then with the notion of Palladian architecture, which was popular in the mid-16th century, particularly in England, but really only became fashionable in the late 17th and early 18th century. And it was popular because it reflected the contemporary understanding of what the great buildings of ancient Rome would have looked like. So classic was in this sense a repetition and a reiteration of the genuinely classical, i.e. the ancient. Along the same lines, in the 1850s, a group of painters in England called themselves the Pre-Raphaelites. Their idea was that painting needed to be renewed by restoring the model and values of the Quattrocento, i.e. the 15th century, and artists like Raphael. Again, the idea is that the classic art can only be made by reference to classical art. Thus, the relation between modern and classical that we think of now has lost its fixed historical reference. What we think of as modernism today assumed its aesthetic contours with people like Baudelaire in the mid-19th century, and he wrote a series of essays called On Modern Painting. From Baudelaire's time through to the mid-1950s, there were several avant-garde movements that claimed to make art new all over again. For Habermas, the high point was Dada and Surrealism, but others would extend it to include Cubism and even pop art, though for most people, pop art is already postmodern. So the cult of the new is an exaltation of the present. It does not so much look forward to the future as insist the future has already arrived. It is in this sense paradoxically dystopian. The celebration of the new discloses a concealed and paradoxical longing for the stability of an unchanging present. And again, it is not difficult to understand this absent any consideration of historical change. So the avant-garde is a restless formation. It positions itself as constantly charting new territories, but this is subject to the law of diminishing returns because there are only so many new territories around, only so many new ways you can be new. Once you've seen one new conceptual artist, you've pretty much seen them all, would be one way of thinking about this. Modernity revolts against, this is Habermas, modernity revolts against the normalizing functions of tradition, and modernity lives on the experience of rebelling against all that is normative. So modernity is not ahistorical as such. It breaks with the false normativity of history, its strict linear causalities, but it also wants to reinvigorate history. So it is also opposed to the static historicism of the museum. And Walter Benjamin coined the term Jetztzeit to describe this approach to history, which sees the present as the opening of a messianic moment in which the past discloses the future. A very bad translation, but not wrong, of Jetztzeit would be sort of the now time or the time of the now. Um, so now, i.e., the 1980s, not right now, the avant-garde spirit seems to be dead, according to Habermas. It is exhausted, it is dominant, but no longer creative. Um, the neoconservatives, particularly in the US, celebrated its death because they blame modernity for the deterioration of the work ethic, but they don't know how to get things back on the right road. And that argument still seems to be going on. That, the sort of anti-woke sentiments are simply a continuation of this opposition to the new and the creative. And Habermas notes that according to Daniel Bell, the American sociologist who is often credited with inventing the concept of the postmodern, um, and this is Habermas, I'm quoting, because of the forces of modernism, the principle of unlimited self-realization, the demand for authentic self-experience, and the subjectivism of a hyper-stimulated sensitivity have come to be dominant. This temperament unleashes hedonistic motives irreconcilable with the disciplines of professional life in society. End of quote. So remember, Bell was writing this in the 1970s, long before the advent of personal computers, the internet, and so on. So Bell's solution is to call for religious faith coupled with a renewed sort of faith in tradition, and hence the neoconservative opposition to gay marriage and all things that seem to take us away from so-called Christian values. Now, the bigger problem here is that the neoconservative position personalizes transformations that are, in fact, social, economic, and technological. It does not see the social and economic causes of changed attitudes, and it blames all changes on individuals. And you can see this in the sort of ludicrously anti-trans position that they take at all times, as though the trans person as an individual is to blame for the breakdown of society. So key cases in point here are the twin neoconservative concepts of resilience and responsibility, two words that should strike fear into your heart. These two character traits are allegedly the difference between people in low socioeconomic groups and those in higher income brackets, as though your family's net worth has no influence on the kind of future you might have. Neoconservatives thus blame culture for societal changes that its own economic program and prerogatives have brought about. Now, cultural studies has long documented this, going right back to the birth of cultural studies in the mid-1970s. For example, the work on Thatcher. Thatcher eviscerated the UK manufacturing and mining sectors, rendering literally millions of people unemployed, and worse still, took away the futures people in those sectors had taken for granted. But then when the kids in the villages turned punk and started singing "We Have No Future," the government described the kids as lacking in culture, and ostracized them. In Australia, we have done exactly the same thing to Indigenous people, taken away their future, and blamed them for not having a future on their lack of character. So if we really want to understand modernity, however, we need to dispense with a focus on art, according to Habermas. He instead turns to another of his important precursors, namely Max Weber. Weber defined modernity in terms of the separation of the reason embodied in religion in metaphysics into three autonomous spheres: science, morality, and art. And these three spheres were differentiated to the extent and because religion and metaphysics fell apart, meaning they were no longer capable of providing existential support for daily life. Now, Weber's theory for this was that Protestantism said that the divine was everywhere and thus unwittingly gave rise to the feeling that it no longer needed to be attended to for itself. If no special rituals were required to profess faith, then everything one did, however profane it might seem, was religious. And in this way, religious thinking quietly passed into extinction. And Jameson refers to this moment as the vanishing mediator. So the differentiations of science, of morality and ethics and so on, and art in turn enable the professionalization and specialization of these disciplines. As the disciplines became specialized, so their knowledge became less and less part of everyday life. And it is in this context that complaints about universities as ivory towers began to happen. In this regard, 19th century knowledge specialization departed from the so-called Enlightenment project of the previous century, which had wanted specialized knowledge to become a means for enriching everyday life, and it promoted the idea of a rationally organized society. And this is Habermas again. He says, Enlightenment thinkers had the extravagant expectation that the arts and sciences would promote not only the control of natural forces, but also the understanding of the world and the self, moral progress, the justice of institutions, and even the happiness of human beings. And he says the 20th century has shattered all such optimism. So specialization of the disciplines has led to a separation of them from everyday life. And this in turn has created resentment, anti-intellectualism, and assorted efforts to negate knowledge reduction, he says. And here you can think of the government's assertion that it would look to only fund useful research, forgetting a huge number of important inventions, discoveries that started out looking utterly useless. The question is, should we try to, this is from us again, he says, should we try to hold on to the intentions of the Enlightenment, or should we declare the entire project of modernity a lost cause? And in many ways, this is the key point that he wants to make. Focusing again on art, Habermas argues that the more autonomous art became, the less able it was to realize its purpose. Hence the desire of surrealism and Dada to blow up art as an autonomous sphere and reconnect it with life. Duchamp's fountain is thus a veritable demonstration that art is part of life. And this, he says, has much the same effect as Protestantism's God is everywhere argument. If everything is art, then art becomes rather difficult to make distinctive. Thus, art relies more and more heavily on other discourses to support itself. So one of the problems with conceptual art, for example, is that it cannot stand up on its own. It needs a whole set of theories and discourses in order to enable us to make any kind of sense of it, so it doesn't just look like a pile of junk. The other problem is that surrealism only shattered one of the three spheres. It did not and could not by itself bring about the full reversal to Enlightenment ideas of dispersed knowledge and expertise. Reification, he says, cannot be overcome by one foray into just one sphere. So this failure on the part of surrealism should not thereby lead us to denounce Enlightenment traditions as terroristic. Habermas's most famous claim, his target is unclear, but generally thought to be Lyotard, and Lyotard certainly responded to it as though it was directed at him. So Adorno and Horkheimer argued that Enlightenment as a whole had failed because at the end of the rainbow was Nazism. For thinkers like Lyotard, any form of prescription of thought is terroristic and runs the risk of initiating a new Nazi or Stalinist type regime. And at stake here is the connection between the ideas of rationality and progress. For Enlightenment thinkers, increasing reason and rationality must lead to and give rise to progressive change. And this is, of course, what Lyotard was challenging. So if you think about Marx's basic position was that as workers become aware of their situation, they would logically seek to change that. And of course, that has not happened. It is this idea more than anything that was brought under attack by Lyotard in the name of the postmodern. So Habermas goes on to claim that the so-called young conservatives, by which he means Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard and so on, are exacerbating the problem by making the imagination, self-experience, and emotion seem to belong to a realm far removed from the everyday life. And most people tend to think that Habermas is completely wrong about this. Old conservatives, he says, like Leo Strauss and Hans Jonas, recommend a pre-modern neo-Aristotelian position. And this manifests itself as the demand for a return to original meanings of things. And see, for instance, the US Supreme Court and its originalist position on the Constitution, and even more strongly, the assertion that there is a national order to things. It emphasizes the importance of natural emotions like fear as the basis of society and so on. And so, one of the most fundamental principles of conservatism, which we see all the time, is that somehow things were better in the old days and everything would be better if we were to return to that, whenever that might actually be. And they're always unclear about that. Old conservatives demand natural right, but since nature isn't fair, this conception of right is not interested in equality. It favors difference and privileges the wealthy as self-made and dismisses the common and everyday. So the neoconservatives, by which Habermas means Wittgenstein, Schmidt, but also Daniel Bell, reinforce the specialization of the spheres of science, morality, and art, but do so precisely to downplay the significance of each to everyday life. Science is important, but it doesn't tell us how to live. Ethics is ungrounded without God, and pure immanence is thereby irrelevant. Habermas's position is that the Enlightenment project is worth continuing with, that it's not over, that it didn't necessarily result in Nazism. That's not the only path it could take. And therefore, the project he refers to as modernity, of making new, of renewing things, is worth continuing with and shouldn't be abandoned at this stage. By contrast, people like Lyotard, as I will discuss in a different lecture, think this position is completely wrong, that the Enlightenment project ended with Nazism, and therefore there is nothing there for us to want to continue with.